The navy blue folder in my hand felt entirely too heavy, the leather grain rough and damp against my skin, but it was the plastic keycard in my other hand that told me something was terribly wrong. I raised the card to the executive suite door. The electronic reader gave a flat, dull beep and flashed a solid, unforgiving red. Down the corridor, the heavy, almost rotting sweetness of white lilies drifted up through the air vents from the grand ballroom, making my throat tighten. I swiped the card again. Another flat beep, another red light. I was Lauren Bishop, 33 years old, a corporate restructuring specialist who had spent 3 years keeping this exact hotel empire out of bankruptcy, and suddenly, my access was gone. A junior audio technician hurried past, his eyes darting to the floor. He mumbled that my husband, Nicholas, had ordered the security team to revoke my credentials just 10 minutes ago. I did not scream, and I did not demand answers. I simply turned my back on the locked door and walked straight toward the ballroom. The double oak doors swung open, hitting me with a blinding wall of chandelier light and the sound of clinking champagne glasses. Up on the main stage, Beverly Whitmore stood at the microphone. My mother-in-law wore a tailored silver suit, her posture rigid, radiating that old money New England perfection. Nicholas stood slightly behind her, studying his expensive leather shoes with intense concentration. When Beverly spotted me in the crowd, she offered a practiced, camera-ready smile and called me up to the stage, speaking loudly to 300 guests about honoring those who had helped the company through a difficult transition period. I climbed the carpeted steps, gripping my blue folder tight. On the podium, Beverly slid a thick, white envelope toward me. It was a resignation and release packet. Before I could even process the document, she gestured to the wings, and Harper Prescott walked out into the spotlight. Harper wore a flawless silk evening gown, looking exactly like the elegant college sweetheart Nicholas had left behind when he married me. Beverly raised her champagne glass to the crowd. She announced Harper as the new strategic advisor for the brand, calling her a true heiress who truly understood the Whitmore family legacy. The ballroom erupted in polite applause. The insult was clear, public, and designed to strip away every ounce of my professional dignity. Nicholas finally looked up, meeting my eyes, and my husband did absolutely nothing to stop it. I looked down at the resignation packet. Beverly uncapped a gold pen and placed it on the signature line, expecting me to disappear quietly like a good, obedient mistake. I picked up the document and flipped directly to the last page. My eyes scanned the dense legal text, catching a specific clause buried in the final paragraph. It demanded that I surrender all residual rights as a creditor and release the Whitmore family from any financial claims. They were not just firing a daughter-in-law. They were trying to erase the secured debt I held over their company. I put the pen down. Closing the packet, I slid it back across the podium. Beverly leaned in close, her perfume smelling like expensive powder and cold calculation. She whispered that if I made a scene, she would withhold my severance and make sure no consulting firm in Boston ever hired me again. Then keep the severance, I told her quietly. I turned and walked off the stage, my navy blue folder tucked safely under my arm. In the dimly lit service hallway behind the kitchens, Marcus was waiting. The general manager of the Harbor Crown held out my wool coat, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he draped it over my shoulders. He told me that half the management team knew who had actually saved the company. The older man pointed toward the employee break room, where my 13-week cash flow model was still taped to the bulletin board. One of the night auditors used to call that spreadsheet my lifeboat, and Marcus promised to keep it exactly where it was. I thanked him, my throat burning, and headed for the exit. The drive home was a blur of streetlights and cold autumn rain. When I reached the luxury apartment I shared with Nicholas, the digital keypad on the front door glowed green, but my personal code flashed an error. He had already changed the lock. 2 of my suitcases sat neatly in the hallway, abandoned outside my own home. I did not pound on the door. I walked back to my car, got into the driver's seat, and let the quiet of the underground parking garage surround me. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was an email from the executive assistant to Henry Vandenberg, the billionaire chairman of our biggest rival. The message was brief. A corporate recruiter had forwarded my operational file, and Henry wanted to see me for an interview tomorrow morning at 9. I read the final line 3 times, feeling the cold air from the dashboard vent dry the sweat on my forehead. At the bottom of Henry Vandenberg's message were 7 words. Bring the blue folder. Do not warn them. The Vandenberg Hospitality headquarters smelled of lemon oil and absolute power. I sat at the far end of a massive mahogany conference table, the navy blue folder resting untouched on the polished wood before me. Henry Vandenberg did not ask how I was feeling. The billionaire chairman did not offer condolences about my marriage or the public humiliation at the Harbor Crown. He simply poured himself a glass of water, sat down, and asked how long the Whitmore empire could survive without a new injection of cash. I did not need to check my notes. My mind immediately pulled up the occupancy rates, the ballooning vendor debts, and the staggering monthly fees Beverly funneled out for private flights and family consulting. I told him they had maybe 3 months before payroll started bouncing, assuming the winter season was strong. If it was weak, they had 6 weeks. Henry nodded once. That single motion told me everything I needed to know about why I was really sitting in this room. This was not a job interview. This was an acquisition meeting. A woman in a sharp charcoal suit stepped into the boardroom, carrying a legal pad. Henry introduced Diane Cole, his lead restructuring attorney. Diane pulled out a chair, her eyes immediately locking onto my blue folder. She asked what exactly I held in my possession. I opened the leather cover and laid out the terms of the rescue financing my firm had provided 3 years ago. $18 million, pooled from private investors, keeping the Whitmore family afloat when their Atlantic Crest project nearly dragged them into bankruptcy. I explained my role as the administrative agent, the person legally authorized to represent the creditor group and enforce the loan. Diane leaned over the table, examining the secured convertible note. The attorney warned me that holding the debt did not magically make me the owner of the hotel chain. A default, she explained carefully, was leverage, not ownership. We still had to earn the company. Henry asked to see the repayment schedule. I slid the historical cash flow documents across the table. He traced his finger down the columns, stopping at the most recent quarter. A payment was missing. It was more than 30 days past due, meaning the grace period had completely expired. My stomach twisted. I pulled up the internal reporting ledger Nicholas had sent me just last week. On my husband's spreadsheet, that exact payment was listed as pending reconciliation. Nicholas had categorized it as an accounting delay, buying time to hide the cash shortfall from me. But the bank statements in my folder told a different story. The money had never moved. Diane flipped to the back of the folder. She pulled out a single sheet of paper and placed it flat on the mahogany table. It was a compliance certificate, dated the end of September. The document bore Beverly Whitmore's unmistakable signature, officially confirming to the lenders that the company was in perfect financial health and no default had occurred. I stared at the black ink. Just 2 days before that certificate was signed, I had sent Beverly an email explicitly warning her about the impending cash shortage. My mother-in-law had not just missed a payment, she had intentionally submitted a fraudulent financial document. Henry leaned back in his chair. The chairman stated his terms with brutal clarity. Vandenberg Hospitality would not swoop in to save me out of charity. He would only provide the capital to buy out the senior banks if Diane's due diligence proved the default was real. Furthermore, Henry demanded that I build a comprehensive operational plan, secure the loyalty of the key hotel staff, and put a substantial portion of my own company's equity on the line. If I wanted his backing, I had to risk everything I had left. I did not hesitate. I told Diane to make the calls. The attorney immediately contacted the creditor group to invoke our emergency inspection rights, and I signed a strict non-disclosure agreement with Vandenberg. While I was signing, Diane logged into the state commercial registry to verify the collateral backing my loan. She confirmed that exactly 52% of the shares in Whitmore Holdings were pledged as security. Beverly no longer held the power she thought she did. Diane turned the certificate toward me. Beverly had signed it 3 weeks after the cure period expired. Diane cleared a space on the mahogany table, dividing my life into 2 neat piles. On the left sat my company-issued laptop and phone. On the right, she placed the loan agreements, the creditor notices, and the operational files belonging strictly to Bishop Recovery Partners. The attorney explained the legal boundary with clinical precision. We could only use what I legally owned as the administrative agent. Everything else had to go back to Whitmore Grand. I slid the black plastic phone across the wood, watching the screen light up with unread messages I would never answer. A few minutes later, Diane pressed a button on her keyboard. The official notice of default went out to Whitmore Holdings, the senior bank, and the board of directors. The document did not instantly declare me the owner of the hotel chain. Instead, it demanded an immediate freeze on insider distributions, a preservation of all financial records, and full access for due diligence. My personal cell rang before we even left the building. Nicholas. His name glowed on the screen, bringing a sudden ache to my jaw. I answered, putting the call on speaker so Diane could hear. My husband used that soft, intimate tone he always deployed when he wanted to smooth over a mistake. He claimed Beverly only wanted to protect the brand and that Harper was nothing more than a temporary consultant. If I just signed the release, he promised I could keep our luxury apartment and a generous settlement. My hands tightened on the edge of the table. I asked him a simple question. Why did a standard resignation packet demand the surrender of my creditor rights? The line went completely silent. 10 heavy seconds passed before Nicholas finally spoke, his voice clipped and defensive, insisting I was misunderstanding standard legal boilerplate. By early afternoon, Beverly made her countermove. A press release hit the local business wires, painting me as a disgruntled former employee, exploiting confidential documents amidst a tragic marital breakdown. My former mother-in-law was requesting a temporary restraining order. She wanted the court to ban me from contacting any hotel staff, vendors, or clients. Reading the statement on Diane's tablet, my stomach dropped. The narrative was flawless, designed to make the legal system view me as a bitter, hysterical wife rather than a secured creditor. The smear campaign was already doing damage on the ground. Marcus called my private number just as the sun started setting over Boston. The general manager spoke quietly, using his personal phone from the employee parking lot. Panic was spreading through the Harbor Crown. 2 major vendors had just frozen the hotel accounts, demanding full prepayment for the weekend banquets. Marcus did not ask for confidential legal details. He simply asked if I had a plan to keep the doors open. I wanted to promise him that everything would be fine, but Diane caught my eye and shook her head. I told Marcus to hold the line, offering nothing but my word that I was working on a solution. Back in the conference room, Diane pulled up a printed document. It was an email Nicholas had accidentally copied to a junior accountant months ago, asking corporate counsel a very specific question. My husband had asked if terminating my employment and forcing me to sign a release would successfully terminate any residual rights under the rescue financing. Diane set the printed email next to the unsigned resignation packet Beverly had shoved at me yesterday. The intent was undeniable. They knew exactly what power I held, and the public firing was a calculated trap to steal it back. My phone buzzed again. Another call from Nicholas. This time, there was no soft apology, no promise of keeping our home. Nicholas lowered his voice and said, "You have until morning to sign. After that, we tell the court you stole everything in that folder." The emergency hearing lasted exactly 12 minutes. Whitmore's attorney, a man in a bespoke suit that cost more than my first car, stood before the judge and demanded a total injunction. He claimed I possessed stolen corporate data and posed a threat to the hotel brand. Diane Cole simply placed my creditor agreement on the defense table, smoothly arguing that the blue folder contained legal loan records, not internal trade secrets. The judge adjusted his glasses, completely unimpressed by the Whitmore dramatics. He issued a narrow ruling. Both sides had to preserve all documents, and I could not publish the files to the press, but my rights as an administrative agent remained fully intact. Before court adjourned, opposing counsel filed a supplemental exhibit. Diane slid a copy over to me, and my breathing stopped for a fraction of a second. It was an internal accounting ledger showing our missing loan payment explicitly categorized as pending reconciliation. Right at the bottom, inked in blue, was the signature of Ellen Park, the corporate controller. Something heavy and cold settled in my chest. Ellen was the woman who had trained me on the hotel's legacy software, and now her name anchored the lie. I remembered her avoiding my eyes near the audio booth at the gala, and for a few miserable hours, I believed she had sold me out. That belief shattered at 7 o'clock that evening. Diane's phone buzzed with an encrypted message, leading us to the back parking lot of a sterile 24-hour diner off the interstate. The autumn wind bit through my wool coat. Ellen stood waiting beside a rusted sedan, clutching a manila envelope against her chest. Her hands were shaking so hard the paper rattled. When I approached, the controller could barely speak, but the words eventually spilled out in a rushed whisper. She confessed that Nicholas had cornered her in her office, threatening to terminate her employment and strip her autistic son of his corporate health insurance if she refused to alter the digital ledger. Ellen shoved the envelope into my hands, stepping back as if the paper burned. Inside was a printed spreadsheet bearing a secure internal timestamp, directly contradicting the exhibit submitted to the judge. The original ledger clearly showed the cash had never been held for reconciliation. Along with the spreadsheet was a printed email from Nicholas, ordering the controller to reclassify the funds into an outbound account labeled as a brand preservation fee. My attorney pulled out her tablet, shielding the screen from the harsh yellow streetlights. Diane's fingers flew across the glass, pulling up state business registrations, and she quickly cross-referenced the receiving account number from the original ledger. It took less than a minute to find the match. The destination was an entity called Whitmore Heritage Consulting. Diane tapped the screen, highlighting the sole managing member, Beverly Whitmore. My mother-in-law had siphoned the exact amount needed to service our debt directly into a private holding company, completely bypassing the hotel chain's operating budget. A harsh chime interrupted the silence. Ellen pulled her phone from her purse, staring at a notification from Human Resources. Her access was permanently revoked due to a supposed security violation. The older woman had just lost her job and her family's medical coverage, simply for handing me the truth. A tight knot formed in my stomach, replacing the initial shock of the theft. This takeover could not just be about executing a financial strategy or securing my own professional vindication. Any acquisition plan I built for Henry Vandenberg had to include a rock-solid guarantee for the employees whose livelihoods were currently being treated as disposable. Ellen reached out, her hand hovering over the glowing tablet screen. Ellen pointed to the transfer and whispered, "The money did not disappear, Lauren. Beverly paid herself." The lobby of the Vandenberg Hotel was an expanse of quiet marble, but the woman pacing near the elevator bank was anything but calm. Harper Prescott wore a tailored camel coat, looking every inch the flawless heiress, though her hands twisted her designer handbag into a tight knot. When she spotted me stepping out of the elevator, she rushed forward. She begged me to withdraw the default notice, claiming thousands of jobs would be destroyed if I crashed the company. I stopped walking, letting the polished silence of the lobby stretch out between us. I asked if she had actually read the joint venture agreement her future husband was pushing through. Harper flinched. The elegant facade cracked, and she admitted that her affair with Nicholas had restarted months ago. She knew Beverly viewed their upcoming wedding as the ultimate brand alliance, and the other woman confessed to staying silent while Beverly publicly humiliated me at the gala. They both treated my public firing as a necessary step for the merger. I felt no urge to offer forgiveness, so I offered nothing at all. Realizing apologies were useless, Harper pulled a thick stack of papers from her bag. It was a draft of the joint venture, forwarded by the corporate attorneys working for her father, Graham Prescott. I carried the documents to a quiet corner table in the lounge and started reading. The contract proposed merging the best Whitmore hotels with two struggling Prescott resorts, using the combined assets to secure a massive bridge loan. Deep in the fee schedules, I found the real motivation. Millions in transaction fees were slated to be paid directly to private holding companies controlled by Beverly and Graham. Then I reached the collateral annex. My finger traced down the list of pledged properties, stopping at 3 luxury estates. I looked up at the bride-to-be, pointing out that these specific assets were registered solely in her name. Harper stared at the page, her face going entirely pale. Her father had called it a family contribution, completely failing to mention that the bank could seize her personal real estate if the new loan failed. Tucked behind the collateral list was an email printout from Nicholas. My husband was pushing the lawyers to close the deal, explicitly stating the bridge loan cash needed to land before the next lender review. Another page detailed a massive retention bonus for the executive vice president, payable immediately upon closing. Nicholas was preparing his escape route. He intended to secure his payout and leave both families, along with thousands of hotel employees, drowning in unmanageable debt. The true heiress had not come to save Whitmore Grand. She was just another piece of collateral, wrapped in white silk and sold to the highest bidder. I took the documents straight up to the executive suite and laid them in front of Henry Vandenberg. The billionaire reviewed the draft, nodding slowly as the fraudulent mechanics of the Prescott alliance became clear. He confirmed the paperwork gave us enough leverage to block the bridge loan. However, stopping a bad deal did not automatically save a dying company. Henry leveled a cold stare at me, explaining the reality of his investment committee. They would not authorize a buyout based on revenge or hidden accounting tricks. If Vandenberg Hospitality was going to fund a takeover, I had to prove the hotels could actually survive. He demanded a comprehensive 13-week cash flow model and written commitments from the key management staff. More importantly, He required me to put the remaining capital of Bishop Recovery Partners on the line. My consulting firm was the only asset I walked away with after the marriage collapsed, and now, he wanted it in the center of the table. Henry slid the term sheet across the table. If I wanted to save the company, I had to risk every dollar I had left. The Vandenberg conference room felt massive and silent, the air heavy with the scent of ozone from the air purifiers. I did not blindly sign away my future the way the Whitmore family had always expected. Diane Cole reviewed the term sheet carefully, tapping her manicured finger against the final clause. The attorney ensured my personal equity from Bishop Recovery Partners was only committed if the due diligence cleared and the core operational staff agreed to stay. I picked up a silver pen, feeling the cold metal against my skin, and signed my name. Building the new 13-week cash flow model required tearing down the illusion of their legacy. My laptop screen filled with historical spreadsheets as I methodically targeted the corporate rot. I deleted the private jet leases and the executive penthouse allowances, and then I completely erased the exorbitant brand preservation fees flowing directly to Beverly. Watching the red numbers turn black felt like breathing clean air for the first time in years. Without the family leeching millions to maintain their social image, the math was incredibly simple. The hotel chain possessed more than enough cash to cover vendor debts and employee payroll. Marcus Reed organized the video conference call for 10 o'clock that night. The general managers logged in from their private offices after the evening service ended, their faces exhausted and pale in the glow of their monitors. I did not ask anyone to violate their non-disclosure agreements or provide internal data. Instead, I laid out 3 firm guarantees. First, no mass layoffs during the initial restructuring phase. Second, every single property would remain open. Finally, if we hit our recovery targets, a profit-sharing trust would be established for the management staff. A sudden burst of static interrupted my presentation. The manager from the Chicago property unmuted his microphone, his voice dripping with suspicion. The man accused me of weaponizing the creditor agreements to destroy the company simply because my husband had abandoned me. My chest tightened, and my fingernails dug into my palms, but I kept my tone perfectly level. I shared my screen, projecting the original ledger that Ellen Park had risked everything to secure. I showed them that the default and the massive cash diversion had occurred weeks before anyone publicly fired me. The digital room went completely silent. Marcus leaned closer to his camera, stating firmly that he would walk away if Beverly stayed, but he would keep his entire staff in place if I was running the board. That single show of solidarity sparked an immediate chain reaction across the grid of faces. By midnight, Diane had drafted a formal retention letter addressed directly to the independent special committee of the board. The document stated that the executive management team would resign if the current leadership retained control, ensuring operational collapse, but they would commit to a restructuring plan led by me. The true value of the empire was never the buildings or the Whitmore names stamped on the entryways. The real leverage was the people who actually kept the lights on. Early the next morning, my phone vibrated loudly against the glass coffee table. A breaking news alert from a local business journal flashed across the screen. The notification featured a glossy, high-definition photo of Nicholas and Harper smiling outside a designer boutique. The Whitmore-Prescott wedding had been abruptly moved up to this coming Saturday. According to the article, the families planned to sign the new bridge loan documents in the Harbor Crown Ballroom immediately after the ceremony. The wedding was not a celebration anymore. It was their closing deadline, and it was 4 days away. The air in the Vandenberg conference room turned instantly freezing. Diane Cole pushed a single sheet of paper across the mahogany table, her normally steady hands unusually tense. Whitmore Corporate Counsel had just submitted a supplemental document to halt our due diligence, and Henry Vandenberg stared at it with a hard, unreadable expression. I picked up the page. It was a side letter, dated 3 years ago, stating that Bishop Recovery Partners formally waived all debt conversion rights in exchange for my permanent advisory role within the family business. My eyes traced the blue ink at the bottom. The signature looked exactly like mine. A cold knot formed in my stomach, because during the initial rescue financing, I had authorized hundreds of pages of legal boilerplate. For a terrifying second, I genuinely wondered if Beverly had slipped this into a stack of routine approvals, and I had blindly signed away my only leverage. Henry closed his leather portfolio with a sharp snap. The billionaire chairman stated flatly that his investment committee would not proceed with funding while ownership of the debt was legally disputed. Less than an hour later, Nicholas texted, asking to meet at a quiet coffee shop near the financial district. The cafe smelled of burnt espresso and wet wool. My husband slid into the booth across from me, ordering nothing. He leaned forward, dropping his voice into that familiar, intimate cadence. Nicholas promised that he could make the side letter completely disappear, provided I withdrew the default notice, signed a quiet divorce settlement, and walked away without filing a lawsuit. His perfectly tailored suit caught the dim lighting, as he offered me a chance to save our respective reputations. The sheer confidence in his posture made my jaw ache. Returning to the Vandenberg offices brought no relief. Diane was pacing the floor, her phone pressed to her ear. Harper Prescott had gone completely silent. When Diane finally got through, Graham Prescott answered the line, coldly announcing that his daughter was recovering at a secluded family resort and accusing me of manipulating her. The heiress was isolated, leaving us without our primary witness to the bridge loan fraud. The situation immediately worsened when Diane checked her encrypted messages. Corporate counsel had just formally threatened Ellen Park with a devastating civil lawsuit for violating her confidentiality agreement. The former controller was paralyzed by fear, terrified of losing everything, and begging to be left out of the boardroom fight. My chest felt tight, the pressure of the collapsing plan pressing down on my lungs. I told Diane to stand down and protect Ellen from any further legal exposure, refusing to destroy another woman just to win this war. The silence in the conference room stretched out, heavy and suffocating. I stared blindly at the side letter resting on the table, the words blurred together, mocking my entire strategy. Then, I reached into my leather tote bag and pulled out the thick, unsigned resignation packet Beverly had shoved at me on the stage of the Harbor Crown. I placed the heavy packet directly next to the side letter. Smoothing the pages flat, I traced the final paragraph of the resignation document. The release demanded that I surrender all residual rights under the rescue financing. My pulse suddenly jumped. I pointed at the text, drawing my attorney toward the table. If I had permanently waived my conversion rights 3 years ago, they would have had absolutely no reason to force a new release on the night they fired me. Nicholas offering to make the document disappear was not an act of mercy. It was an act of desperation, because he knew the paperwork was fabricated. Diane looked from the old side letter to the unsigned release. If this was real, Lauren, they would not have begged you to surrender the same rights twice. The heavy mahogany doors of the boardroom loomed at the end of the corridor, looking exactly the same as they had during my 3 years of loyal service. My old access card remained completely useless in my pocket. Diane Cole swiped a temporary visitor badge over the security panel, and the electronic lock clicked open, letting us into the room where portraits of Whitmore patriarchs stared down from the paneled walls. Beverly sat at the head of the massive table, flanked by corporate counsel and Nicholas, projecting absolute confidence. Diane did not waste time with pleasantries or formal introductions. The attorney walked straight to the podium and connected her tablet to the main display screen, immediately projecting the digital audit trail from our secure signing platform. Every legitimate document from the rescue financing 3 years ago carried a unique transaction identification number, a digital fingerprint sent to every signatory. The side letter that Nicholas had tried to use against me had nothing. It was just a blank space in the system. Furthermore, Diane produced a sworn affidavit from the law firm that had drafted the original loan, confirming their office had never drafted, issued, or recorded any such waiver. I placed my own piece of evidence on the polished wood. The unsigned resignation packet landed with a heavy, satisfying thud. I pushed the document toward my husband, asking the independent directors why the company needed me to surrender my creditor rights on a Thursday if I had already permanently waived them 3 years ago. Nicholas shifted in his expensive leather chair, the color draining from his face as his knuckles turned white against the armrests. The boardroom doors suddenly swung open again, breaking the heavy tension. Harper Prescott stepped inside, breathing heavily, followed closely by a severe-looking man carrying a thick leather briefcase. She announced that her father had tried to isolate her at a secluded family resort, but since her personal estates were listed as collateral, she had hired her own legal counsel to protect herself. The heiress dropped the joint venture draft onto the table, directly contradicting the official timeline Beverly had fed the board. Harper looked straight at the special committee and confirmed that Nicholas desperately needed the new bridge loan cash to land before the upcoming lender review. Diane tapped her tablet one more time, activating the automated board portal recording system. The audio from a previous executive session filled the silent room. Beverly's voice echoed from the overhead speakers, arrogantly assuring everyone that the banks would stop asking questions the moment Harper officially became family. Then came Nicholas, his recorded voice frantic, insisting they only needed the new money to hide the shortfall from the auditors. The polished veneer finally shattered. Beverly stood up abruptly, her perfectly manicured hands slapping flat against the table. My former mother-in-law lost her practiced composure entirely, turning her venom directly on me instead of addressing the evidence. She told the independent directors that the hotels belonged to her bloodline, calling me hired help who had simply married above my station. The sheer contempt in her voice echoed off the wood paneling, proving to every board member exactly how she viewed the company as her personal piggy bank. Henry Vandenberg stepped forward to present the proof of capital, while I walked the committee through the revised cash flow model and the retention letter signed by every general manager. The choice facing the directors was brutal but clear. They could either side with massive fraud and face a total staff walkout, or they could accept our restructuring proposal. The special committee immediately called for a vote to suspend executive powers pending the final closing. Facing total defeat, Nicholas stared at the fabricated side letter and suddenly broke. My husband slumped back in his chair and whispered that the fake document was only supposed to buy them 2 weeks. That panicked, quiet confession destroyed their final defense. The committee voted before midnight. By morning, Beverly still owned shares, but she no longer controlled a single decision. The final closing took 3 exhausting days of brutal financial audits and endless legal drafting, leaving the Vandenberg conference room littered with cold coffee cups and empty takeout boxes. Just before dawn on Saturday morning, Diane Cole placed the final resolution on the mahogany table. The paperwork officially executed the debt-to-equity swap authorized by the special committee. My consulting firm converted our secured debt into controlling shares, while Henry wired the capital to pay off the restless senior banks. I picked up my silver pen and signed the bottom line, finally becoming the controlling shareholder of Whitmore Grand. The sun was just rising over the Boston skyline when Henry picked up his phone. Today was supposed to be the hastily rescheduled date for the Whitmore-Prescott wedding. The billionaire dialed Beverly's private number, putting the device on speaker so Diane and I could hear the line connect. When the matriarch answered, Henry did not bother saying hello. He simply delivered the final blow with ruthless precision, telling her to cancel her son's wedding because her former daughter-in-law had just bought her entire company. 2 hours later, I walked into the Harbor Crown. The grand ballroom doors were securely chained shut, flanked by 2 private security guards holding strict orders to prevent any unauthorized use of corporate property. Beverly arrived in a pale silver mother-of-the-groom dress, her perfect composure cracking entirely as she stared at the heavy brass padlocks. Nicholas hurried in right behind her, looking frantic in his custom tuxedo, his eyes darting around the empty foyer. A few early guests lingered near the lobby bar, whispering behind their hands, but the real spectacle happened near the coat check. Harper Prescott walked through the revolving glass doors wearing a simple trench coat instead of a bridal gown. The heiress did not look at me. She marched straight up to Nicholas, pulled the massive diamond engagement ring off her finger, and dropped it onto his palm. Harper informed him that her legal team had already forwarded the fraudulent joint venture documents to the state authorities. Then, she turned around and walked out of the hotel without a single backward glance. I did not stay to watch the groom panic. I took the private elevator up to the top floor and unlocked the executive suite using my newly coded master keycard. 10 minutes later, Beverly burst through the office doors, her face flushed with unmasked rage. My former mother-in-law marched toward the heavy oak desk, demanding that I remember exactly who had taken me in and given me a family. I settled into the leather executive chair, leaning back and resting my hands on the polished wood. "You never gave me a family," I told her, keeping my voice perfectly steady. "You gave me a job without a title, a marriage without loyalty, and a debt you thought I was too grateful to collect." The silence in the room became absolute. Beverly opened her mouth to argue, but the words died in her throat as Marcus Reed stepped through the doorway. The general manager quietly informed her that her corporate privileges had been officially revoked. Security officers were currently confiscating Nicholas's company devices and suspending his access to the building, pending a full independent investigation into his accounting practices. Beverly refused to let the guards touch her. She turned stiffly and walked out of the office, her silver dress rustling against the doorframe. I followed them out to the corridor, watching as she approached the private elevator bank. Out of pure, stubborn habit, Beverly swiped her executive keycard against the wall reader. The machine gave a flat, dull beep and flashed a solid, unforgiving red. It was the exact same sound that had locked me out on the night she fired me, closing the circle perfectly. As the elevator doors finally slid shut on Beverly, Diane stepped into the hallway. My attorney carried a stack of fresh paperwork and placed 3 sealed envelopes squarely on my new desk. One for the lenders, one for the investigators, and one for my husband. 4 months passed before the Harbor Crown Ballroom opened for a celebration that actually mattered. I stood at the exact same podium where Beverly had tried to ruin my career, looking out at a packed room of hotel staff. The air smelled of fresh coffee and the blooming winter jasmine arranged on the tables. Our occupancy rates had finally stabilized, and the vendors were completely paid up. Leaning into the microphone, I announced the launch of the new Management Profit-Sharing Trust, along with the appointment of an independent ethics board. The applause that followed was not polite or forced by fear, it was deafening. The Whitmore matriarch was not there to hear it. Beverly had been forced into a brutal civil settlement, requiring her to sell every remaining share she owned just to repay the brand preservation fees she had stolen. Following the exposure, the Regional Hotel Association permanently suspended her membership. State investigators were still digging through the false compliance certificates, meaning the threat of a courtroom would hang over her for years. Nicholas fared no better. My soon-to-be ex-husband signed a binding agreement to return his executive bonuses, permanently barring him from ever holding a financial role within the new corporate structure. To avoid a drawn-out trial, he accepted full civil liability for the manipulated accounting reports, and our divorce settlement was already signed, just waiting on a judge's desk for the final decree. He had called once, his voice thick with regret, asking for a second chance. I simply let the voicemail expire and deleted the recording. The Prescott family empire fractured just as spectacularly. Graham lost his massive bridge loan and immediately faced an aggressive banking investigation over his inflated property valuations. To cover his mounting debts, the older man was forced to liquidate his flagship resort at a staggering loss. Harper surrendered the gifts and benefits tied to the joint venture, turning her father's own emails over to the auditors. Graham cut off her trust fund the very next day. I heard through Diane that the heiress had taken an entry-level consulting job in Chicago, but I did not reach out, because saving her was never my responsibility. Later that afternoon, Henry Vandenberg sat across from my desk. The billionaire chairman drank his black coffee and asked if I wanted to rip the Whitmore name off every single property in our new portfolio. I looked out the floor-to-ceiling window, watching the winter snow begin to fall over Boston. Tearing down the old signs would have been a perfect, petty revenge, but doing so would erase decades of hard work built by the actual staff. I told Henry that the historic properties would keep their original signage, but the new parent corporation would be officially registered as Bishop Hospitality Group. We were not destroying the past. We were simply ensuring the Whitmore family could never control the future. Henry finished his coffee, nodded his approval, and left me alone in the executive suite. I opened the bottom drawer of my desk and picked up the navy blue folder. The leather felt lighter now. I placed it inside an archival box, closing the lid on the rescue financing that had started this entire war. My desktop was completely clear of silver-framed wedding photos. Instead, the polished wood held only the framed retention letter signed by my general managers, resting right beside my new master keycard. The plastic badge bore my full name and the title of Chief Executive Officer. I grabbed my wool coat and headed down to the main lobby. The massive space was bustling with afternoon check-ins, and the atmosphere had entirely shifted. Employees did not freeze or lower their eyes when I walked past. A young bellhop smiled, and Marcus Reed caught my eye from across the concierge desk, offering a respectful nod to a colleague. I did not inherit their empire. I earned the right to rebuild it, and this time, my name was on the door. Sometimes the people who demand the most loyalty are the ones most prepared to betray you. When you find yourself trapped in a family dynamic where your worth is measured only by what you can provide, you have to remember that compliance will never buy you respect. You cannot heal a toxic environment by simply working harder, sacrificing more, or hoping that those who use you will suddenly wake up and appreciate your value. True empowerment starts the moment you stop waiting for validation from people who are committed to undermining you. Instead, you must learn to build your own leverage. Keep your records, protect your boundaries, and never surrender your financial or emotional independence just to keep the peace at a holiday dinner table. Loyalty is a beautiful trait, but it should never be a weapon used to strip away your dignity. The hardest lesson is realizing that walking away, or choosing to fight back with cold logic, is not an act of cruelty. It is an act of survival. You have the undeniable right to claim the space you have earned, and you never owe your silence to the people who tried to bury you. Have you ever stayed too long in a situation because you confused exploitation with duty? And what finally gave you the courage to pack up your own files and take back your power? Share your story in the comments, because your truth might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.